Hi, and welcome back. Last podcast, we talked about the organization within the biosphere, the different ecological levels, and a little bit about population ecology, how populations grow and their different characteristics. Now we want to focus in on the community. So remember, a community is a group of all of the different populations of all of the different species that are living together in one area. And so we want to look at how they interact with each other. And so when we look at communities, we can measure them in two ways. We can look at the diversity and density of species within that community. So one way that we can look at diversity is by looking at species richness. This is the number of different species that we would find in a community. So both community 1 and community 2 have 4 different species of trees. And so they have equal species richness. But that's not all we want to look at. We also want to look at the relative abundance, or how many of each species are represented within that community. And so if we look at community number 1, we can see that each species is equally represented, whereas community number 2 is dominated by species A, and there's little room for species B, C, and D to survive. And so when we're looking at diversity within these two communities, we would say that community number 1 has greater species diversity. Now, the other thing we want to look at when we're looking at community interactions is how does competition affect the populations that are living within this community? So organisms are going to compete for a lot of different things like food or water or territory or mates, and competition can occur between different species or even within the same species of organisms in a community. And so here's an example of some interesting competition. So a famous scientist from Russia, Gauss, he actually grew one species of paramecium in a culture, and then he grew a different species that was very similar in a different culture, and he noticed they had very similar growth patterns. They were both thriving in the population, or in their cultures equally. But then when he put them together in the same culture, he noticed that the first species grew really well, and the second species totally died out. It became extinct within that community. And this is what we call competitive exclusion principle. This says that two species can't coexist in a community if they share the same niche. Now, this niche, that's just like, that means that they're competing for the same resources. And so what was happening here is this first species of paramecium was outcompeting the second species when they were grown together, which caused the second species to die off in that community. So there are a couple of different results of competition. Obviously, that first one is extinction. An animal or plant is not going to be able to survive. It's weaker in terms of competition, and it dies out within that group of organisms. But we can also have what's called resource partitioning. So a really good example of this is the warblers. Now, the warblers we would think of them as competing for areas in the tree and where they're going to gather the different seeds from the pine cones of these trees. But when we studied them closer, we noticed that they partitioned up their resources. So some of the warblers only fed and were found on the very outside of the tree. Some of them were found here in the middle, some at the very top, some only at the very bottom. And so instead of trying to compete with each other for all of the food in all parts of the tree, they divvied up the resources and focused in on only certain parts of the tree, and then they could all be successful within that community. Now, we also have what's called character displacement. So this occurred, a really awesome example of this are the finches on the Galapagos Islands. So instead of partitioning up their resources or some of them going extinct, what we saw was natural selection was occurring, and it actually over time changed the phenotypes, the beak shape of the different finches so that they could diverge, become different from each other, and when they become different from each other, then they could focus in on specific types of food. So these large ground finches are going to eat the large seeds, the small beaked finches are going to eat the small seeds, and now they are no longer competing with each other for resources. And so that's can be some of the results of competition within a community. Now, another type of community interaction that's a driving force is predation. This is when one organism is going to eat another. And this could be animals eating other animals, or it could be animals eating plants. It could be fungus eating different organisms as well. And so there's a couple of different things that we can see that organisms have evolved to protect themselves against predation. So plants have spines or thorns that can even produce toxins or poisons that are going to prevent themselves from getting eaten. We have animals that have evolved active defenses like running, hiding, or like things like these horns for fighting. But that takes up a lot of energy. So we also have passive defenses as well. Things like camouflage. So take a look at this really cool insect. You'd barely be able to see it if it was up in a tree with lots of leaves. It would blend right in. We also have coloration that's going to provide some sort of warning. So this poison dart frog has got this red color to warn predators that it is poisonous, and that's going to make it less likely to get eaten. And we also have these ideas where animals start to copy each other. For example, this is the monarch butterfly, and it tastes really bad. This is the viceroy butterfly, and it tastes just fine, but because it looks a lot like the monarch butterfly, animals aren't going to eat this butterfly because they're afraid it's going to taste bad. So that's an example of mimicry. And so animals and plants have devised all of these different ways to survive predation. Now, another thing we can look at is predator-prey curves. And so if we look at this example of the hare and the lynx, notice when the lynx population starts to go down, now there are less predators, which allows the hare population to start to skyrocket. There is no threat of getting eaten. But as that population increases, more food is available for the lynx, which causes the lynx population to start to increase. But as that population of predators increases, notice that the prey population starts to decrease. And so what we see is this a gap between the increase-decrease in the prey and the predator. One population size is going to affect the size of the other population. So these are linked very strongly. Now, another thing we want to take a look at within communities is ideas related to symbiotic relationships. A symbiotic relationship is any close interaction between species within a community. Now, some of these symbiotic relationships are beneficial, whereas others can be harmful to organisms. But either way, they're going to have a great impact on the community and the survival of the organisms within that community. So let's take a look at some different examples. The first example is one of my absolute favorites in terms of symbiotic relationships. It's an example of mutualism. Mutualism is a type of symbiotic relationship in which both organisms within the relationship are going to benefit. So we could label it plus. Now, these are leafcutter ants. Leafcutter ants are going to cut out chunks of the leaves, and they are going to bring them back to their little colony. But the ants themselves can't actually eat and digest the leaves. They have lots of cellulose that they're really hard to digest. But what they do is they farm this white fungus. And the fungus can break down the plants, and it breaks them down into these really nice simple sugars, which the ants can feed on. And so this is an example of mutualism because the ants are getting food from the fungus, and the fungus is getting food from the ants, these lovely little leaves. And so that's a really great example of mutualism. Now, another example, another type of symbiotic relationship is commensalism. This is where one organism is benefiting, plus, and the other one is really unaffected. So 0. An example would be these barnacles on the whale. Now the barnacles are going to attach themselves to a whale. It gives them a great attachment point. It also gives them an opportunity to eat lots of food as the whale is moving through the water. Some of the food is not going to make it into the whale's mouth, and so the barnacles get to eat up the scraps. Now the whale is really unaffected by these barnacles. It's not helping the whale, it's not hurting the whale, so this is an example of commensalism. Now the last type of relationship is where one organism is going to benefit while the other is going to be harmed. This is called parasitism. This is an example of a parasitic wasp, and this wasp is going to lay its eggs on the caterpillar, in the caterpillar, and it's going to develop into these little eggs here. The eggs will hatch into larvae, and then the larvae eat the caterpillar. Obviously, the wasp larva is benefited because it's getting a place to develop and lots of food to eat when it hatches. This is bad news for the caterpillar, however, because it's going to result in the caterpillar's death. And so those are examples of symbiotic relationships. And so those are how we see different interactions within a community. And so we can look at those interactions within a community, and that's going to help us to understand the health of that community and also human impacts on that community. All right, thanks for watching.